Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and I am very pleased to have artist Dave Seeley. Dave, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Jonathan.
All right, so the first question I have for you is how did you get into professional painting and artwork?
So I mean, it's like I've been making artwork for as long as is my earliest memories as a child. And then in high school, I was um a reasonably adept student and also had been taking art classes my whole life up until my late teens. And at the time, it seemed like the artists were the kids who were hanging around out back and doing
Mhm.
drugs, smoking weed, many of whom I could relate to, but they were not students. So I sort of thought that artists were not, just they were not academically bright people. They were just talented, gifted people in that way.
Mhm.
And at the time, I thought my calling was going to be architecture because it was some combination of those two things. And it turned out that in architecture school at Rice University in Houston, I discovered what architecture was, but it took a couple of years and it
Mhm.
was not such a dumb, simple thing. But I liked it enough to survive the high attrition rate, which I think is largely for people who find out what it is and decide they don't want to do what it is,
Mhm.
and then proceeded to graduate and practice for a dozen years. And then I won a traveling fellowship and went around the world with my wife. And on that trip, we got pregnant, and I got inspired by artwork and architecture on that world trip, and decided, in fact, that I wanted to try my hand at professional illustration because I had become a fanboy for that.
Mhm.
And I also wanted to be a more active parent at home rather than being a full-time architect. My wife was a full-time lawyer and, in fact, quickly worked her way into public service via affordable housing, the state affordable housing agency. And so she was already full time, and so we tag teamed and raised my son at the time. So then, that was 20. It's easy because it's the same age as my son, so we're coming up on late 20s, and um, I'm now, we're both looking at retirement, and probably 5 or 6 years ago, I started concentrating more on gallery art.
Mhm.
And so the gallery art stuff you're seeing is newish in terms of 5 or 6 years, but there are very similar things that go back almost to high school because that's my desire to make figurative artwork was even then.
Um,
So that's
uh,
kind of where we're at.
So you talked about your you talked about being inspired when you were traveling and seeing the architecture and stuff. Do you have any artists, whether they be of like traditional paintings or of book cover artists, that were particularly inspiring, those were the ones that got you specifically thinking, I want to do that too?
So what's funny is that I think we have this we kind of compartmentalize the way we think about art. And so I certainly thought about art in commercial illustration as a very different animal than fine art.
Hmm.
But there are times when each of them get very close to the other.
Hmm.
And it's actually those blurrier lines that I tend to like the best.
Hmm.
Um, but and in illustration, when I decided I was going to become an illustrator, I was um, at that point, my favorite stuff had been comics. I
Oh,
was sort of a comics nut and painted comics. So people like Ken Williams and John Van Fleet and
yeah.
that period in comics, which was, in retrospect now looking like a pretty distinct period.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and also, I think, at that point, I already had favorite painters like John Singer Sargent and Caravaggio
Mm-hmm.
and um, those kinds of guys. I was turned on by fellow illustrators to Robert McGinnis, who did a whole bunch of 70s pulp paperback
Mm-hmm.
novels that I became a huge fan of and very interested in his technique. So yeah, and then toward the last 6 or 7 year period going back toward figurative art of figures, figurative
Mm-hmm.
artwork. I have touched base with that stuff again. The funny thing is that if you went back to like the classic 60s, 70s, even 50s science fiction fantasy architect and art,
Mm-hmm.
um, I I was not such a big fan, but I was hugely inspired by 80s, 90s, 70s, even um, cinematography. So
Okay.
Star Wars was huge for me
Yep.
in terms of like, holy, like, what is that? And things like Blade Runner and Alien and um, that even the notion of Terminator and the futuristic portrayals of worlds in movies hugely influential in terms of my science fiction art making, much more so than kind of classic sci-fi illo, which I've never actually been able to take that seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Although honestly, taking things like Batman and Superman seriously is a stretch, right? It's like here's guys wearing their underwear on the outside of their clothes, and maybe.
Well, it's really cool that you mentioned Star Wars as such a big inspiration for your art because you've actually done some Star Wars art
Oh
for
yeah,
two of the
yeah,
New Jedi Order books and for
yeah,
the
yeah.
Luke Skywalker Shadows of Mindor book. So that must be just really cool, like the ultimate dream to.
Yeah, well, it's been very fun to play in those various sandboxes. Although oddly, I'll say like my Luke Skywalker piece is probably my most well-known piece, mostly because the property of Star Wars is ubiquitous. It's
Mm-hmm.
like you do a
Yep.
thing like that, and now it's in every train station, bus station. It's everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Far, far more. It's like if you go back to very well-known science fiction writers who don't, nobody has that kind of throw, right?
Right.
So it's like I'm working on another. I think the last book in a recent, uh, a very popular series by Tim Zahn.
The Icarus Saga.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, I'm two-thirds, three-quarters through the last manuscript for that book now, and Tim, I got to meet because I had done like I think his first Thrawn book was Outbound Flight. And then so I met him at Comic-Con where I exhibited for decades and went back and forth, but was paired up by Bain to do that series. And,
Mm-hmm.
here's a guy who is a prolific, great science fiction fantasy writer.
Mm-hmm.
But so many more people know his Star Wars work because it's Star Wars and it's
Right.
everywhere and it's a multi-billion-dollar promotion machine.
Mm-hmm.
So no individual can compete with that.
Well, you already mentioned this, so I'm going to go ahead and bring it up. You mentioned his Icarus saga, which there's a ton of books. You did the cover art for Icarus Plot, and you did Icarus Twin and Icarus Job, and then we have the ones that are coming out that are Changeling, Needle, and then the last one, which I forgot the name of. But that series has just that very distinct style where most of the books you have like maybe three characters or two characters on them. You have Celine, you have Gregory Rourke. How did you go about deciding the style that you used for that, and specifically what the image on the cover would be?
So the interestingly, there was the Icarus plot was actually preceded those, but the Icarus plot was not with Bane.
Hunt, you
Um,
mean?
say again?
Icarus Hunt was the one before Bane. Yeah.
Good. Amen. You got it. So that one, not Bane.
Yeah.
And in a bunch of the characters from that prior novel worked their way into this series, right?
Hmm. Right.
But and in fact, the heroes of this series were peripheral in the first one.
Hmm.
I think I haven't even read the first one. So
The main characters from the first one play a part here, but Gregory and Celine are unique to the Bane books.
they weren't even named in that first novel.
Unless I totally missed it when I read it. They're not in it.
I can't remember going back to the first of the Bane books. Gregory gets his hand shot off, and
Hmm.
supposedly that happened while he was mixing it up with the first cast. And I
Hmm.
think Jordan McKell was sort of
Yep.
the James Bond character of that first group.
Hmm.
And he hates Jordan. And I don't know whether Jordan is the guy who shot his hand off or it was he somehow, I think, blames Jordan for that
Hmm.
regardless. And it's kind of interesting as you work your way into this one to see the way that the various allegiances happen. But the series is brilliant and also very kind of international relations heavy, right?
Hmm.
It's like every species has their own intelligence groups. Within the species, there are different groups that are fighting each other, and it's just such a mass of negotiations and subterfuge and spying and you name it. So very rich in terms of that kind of a whodunit,
Hmm.
world building scenario. But the first one that we did was really, that one is what you would call my friend Rick Barry calls it a pigeon roost, where you've got this cast of characters in a heroic pose,
Hmm. Yeah.
and you figure out about how many you can jam on there without it becoming ridiculous.
Like
And
some
then,
movie posters today.
well, and I do my best to avoid the montage thing,
Yep.
right? So, and that not that I don't think that can be done very well, it certainly can be.
Hmm.
It's just not what I want to do. So, short of doing that, but even then, you end up with a little 1 inch character and then some guy with a head this big.
Right.
Um, Inherently you're and even the way that we posed the first Bane book, it's pretty clear who the
Who the main
central
characters?
characters are.
Yep.
And then you work your way out. I think yeah, if I think back to that cover, I think everybody is quite nameable in that.
Hmm.
But it's interesting. It's like I'm now going through this and in the last book there is a race of people whose world is the first half of the book happens in that world. And um you know I Tim doesn't even have to tell you what that species looks like. So I went back and I'm like, what the hell do they, all right, who are they, what do they look like? And I'm like word searching prior manuscripts and they're not there. And then I'm word searching this book and I'm going through every mention of them and no description. So in the end, it's like the, you know, the reason it's taken me a week to read this book is that when I read a book, I see a movie.
Hmm.
but it's like every time I come up against a species who I don't have a description for, it's like they're blurred out,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yep. Yep.
So I don't know. Um, but anyway, that was a good approach to that. And then I feel like we've actually done a bunch of and what can happen, and I think Tim is doing this, I'm not sure because I haven't had a direct conversation with him about it recently, but I think there are things in this last book that he is actually responding to the artwork from prior books
Really
and kind of made them canon, which can happen, right?
interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
That's really interesting. I really like the cover art for this series. My favorite one so far is Job. I love the look of the characters in the Icarus Job. And you're right that sometimes Tim doesn't always describe every species in it, and that can be frustrating. But you mentioned you're reading through the book. Is that standard procedure for you for a cover for a book that you will read through the whole
So
book?
it certainly has been for this series.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes it's not available. It's like
Mm-hmm.
by the time
Yeah.
the whole schedule for what they do to um uh they sort of back up from their schedule. So
Yeah.
for instance, this one is very late arriving because they didn't know kind of the horse trading of what was going to be next season because they have to wait and see what's actually done in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then they have to go through a meeting with sales reps where there's a sales rep meeting coming up. And so the last this one and the prior one, they didn't come to me with the request to do it until there was no time to do it.
Mm.
So it was a little nutty. And these things are typically, between the first sales meeting and the time that the book is available to the public can be a year.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's sort of what happens. And oftentimes the art has to happen before the manuscript is in a point where it can be, you know. And honestly, for me, there are times where if the author and the publisher have talked and decided that they really want a certain thing on the cover or
Mm-hmm.
an action in the book or characters or whatever, it can make my life a lot simpler.
Yeah.
Um, and in this particular one, sometimes there's a synopsis or a couple of suggestions from authors that, this could work, that could work, that could work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in this one, it's pretty much been I've read the books and then bounced ideas off of Tony Weisskopf at
Yeah.
Bain,
Mm-hmm.
who's used to be all things art, even when Jim Bain was around, and now she's
Mm-hmm.
all things Bain. So,
Yep.
but she's still doing all the art. And then um, we agree on what we think is probably the right way to go, and then I launch into it.
That's really cool. Because I know so many cover artists that just don't they try not to read or they're not readers, so they just do whatever is the minimum necessary, the blurb or the specific scene. And I understand sometimes you don't have time when they get that time crunch happens, but it's really cool that when the time's available that you've read a full series. For talking about another series from Bain that you've done the cover art, you did the cover art for Howard Andrew Jones's Lord of a Shattered Land and City of Marble and Blood and Shadow of Smoking Mountain. And this series, the books themselves, anyways, as books, harken back to the sword and sorcery style books of, years ago, I mean, 100 years ago with Howard, Robert E. Howard. But this covers also look really retro in feel. And in fact, when I was posting one of the covers online after I read it, someone said, "Is that a new release? It looks like it's from like the 80s or 90s." And they
Yeah,
meant
yeah.
that as a compliment. So how did the approach for you going into that series?
Yeah, so I mean, a quick response to the last thing you said was that style tends to be very fashionable,
Mm-hmm.
and it comes and goes.
Yeah.
So I will say that if you go to my website and look at my publishing portfolio right now, it's an absolute mess um, by modern day publisher comments to me. People who've
Mm-hmm.
gone there, they look at it, are like, "Oh my God, like there's just too much." And it also the science fiction fantasy cover work has been sort of the last bastion of the fully illustrated epic cover.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And mainstream publishing has all, become
Yep.
giant foil embossed type and author name and a little tiny diagrammatic, you know. And so what's happened is science fiction and fantasy has followed that in a big way. And there's still some kind of two-dimensional flat color art and some beautiful stuff being done, but it's very stylized.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm at a point now, it's like I'm 64 at this point, and I'm at a point where I could go through my folio and rebuild 25 pieces, which is all that probably should be on my in my publishing folio. And let me see if I what have I got on there? Right now I have 256.
Mm-hmm.
So it should be 25. And I could go ahead and rebuild that folio for today, especially using things like Photoshop generative fill, where I can now shrink the cover down and give myself an extra 2 inches of bleed all around,
Mm-hmm.
because that starts to be what they need
Yep.
for megatype and the author name and whatever. I mean, they need. So that's the design that wants to happen. But again, I'm at a point where my focus has shifted, and I'm making gallery figure paintings. So I don't know that I want to do that much more of this. So the Howard Andrew Jones, I mean, the it's it was pitched to me by Tony as kind of the Thinking Man's Conan series.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So immediately I'm going back and thinking about the Frazetta Conan pictures with
Mm-hmm.
and literally the things I liked best about that were when Conan was like flying in to a fray of warriors that were hell bent on killing him, and he's just like launched himself through the air, flying in, to be a berserker. And I literally started the cover that you saw that way, and
Mm-hmm.
had this guy flying through the air, blah blah blah. And this is before I got the manuscript. And then the concept, I believe, I think I can say that. So Hanuvar he's a defeated Hannibal
Mm-hmm.
in of Carthage, and he was sort of caught away from home as his people were conquered and sold into slavery, and he is now trying to pick up the pieces and save the vestiges of his people, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So he pretty much starts off at a low point.
Yeah.
And as the books progress, how many books are we out right now? One,
The
two.
third book comes out in October.
Right. So you'll see that you probably already get that, you know, each book leaves him a little better off than the last.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Otherwise, it would be such a downer that we would not want to read the
Right.
next
Right.
one. And I really enjoyed the historical aspects and the, Hannibal and the Roman Empire and what was going on with all that, the architecture, the art, you name it. And for me, it actually read kind of like the Witcher series, where
Yeah.
there's this
Interesting.
long arc, but it's episodic,
Mm-hmm.
where you go through and there are these episodes that you learn more and more about the character with each episode, but overall it has that kind of character on the road, meeting some adversity or some situation, and by his wits and his skills, pulls his ass out of the fire over and over again. So it was kind of great that way. But what happened was that I had this sort of wild flake, flying berserker of a character, um, flying into that scene ready to take on the serpent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But in the story, first of all, the serpent can read your mind.
Mm-hmm.
So it ain't like you're going to get the drop on a serpent. And the beautiful sorceress is there,
Mm-hmm.
and she is um, sent in with Hanuvar in the first book, and they're essentially trying to do damage control to the serpent, who feels like it's not getting its payola from the local king, who's sort of a stupid mofo, but in the end, that cover wasn't going to work because it did not. It was so kind of the antithesis of what the scene was, even though it was a glorious scene in and of itself.
Right.
And it became clear to me, I think, even before it was clear to Tony, that she was not going to be able to go back to Howard and tell him that, yeah, here's the cover, which flies in the face of the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I sort of even knew then that that wasn't going to cut it, and he really needed to be. And it had been her. She also had a concept where he himself in each book needed to appear to be, you know, most downtrodden originally, and then kind of
Mm-hmm.
becoming more and more, even in the second book, he clearly is fighting a very impressive battle, but the guy he's fighting is bigger than him, has
Mm-hmm.
higher ground, better
Yep.
position, you name it. And so I'm glad we did what we did, even though I sort of loved that Frazetta inspired berserker flying into the fray initially.
I
But
can I can
that can
totally
happen.
see that vision now of him being at the low end, and each book
Yeah, yeah,
he's higher up, and like literally in the book he's getting further up the page, and I'm like that is such a
yeah,
cool
yeah.
concept. I want to transition a little bit to talk. We were going to talk about your gallery work in a second, but we're talking about your website, which you mentioned earlier. You do sell prints, and I
Aha.
did purchase one, and I just think this is just gorgeous.
Ta-da.
These prints are
Yeah,
great. So
yeah.
if you're wanting any of his artwork, go to his website. But you also not only sell the prints of the book covers, or some of the book covers, I don't know if it's all of them, but you also sell your gallery stuff sometimes on there, and your figurative paintings. And so I wanted to give you a moment to talk about some of the figurative paintings you have, and where to find them on your website.
Sure. So I've actually and print sales are fine, but literally that is so not the way I make my living.
Hmm.
In fact, what happens is that prints are actually a great way to name build.
Yeah.
They sort of get out there, people see them, they go see what you're doing and check you out. But the reality is that probably maintaining any kind of inventory and the hassles of getting the prints made and sending them out. Although the
Right.
one that you have is actually handled by the website, where they just give you a little piece of it and they do it all, which is fine because it means it's pennies from heaven with no effort.
Yeah.
Um, but again, this is not it's not really fueling the machine. It's actually except to the extent that it's fueling outreach.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So gallery work is radically different, where you're selling an original unique piece of art, and
Hmm.
is it's an interesting game, and it's a game. You know, the weird thing for me is when I'm selling illustrations for sci-fi fantasy stuff, I don't have a gallery. So the purchase price of that all goes in my pocket minus whatever I'm shipping it to you for. And it's
Hmm.
also typically after I've gotten a fee to make the cover to begin with.
Yeah.
With gallery art, half of it goes to the gallery and they earn their money. But
Hmm.
in the long haul, it means that for you to make it for to be really worthwhile to make a piece, it's really got to start at around $5,000 or $6,000, right?
Hmm. Right.
And for many galleries and artists, the way to get around that problem and make less expensive art is to make smaller art. But the problem is that I don't really want to make smaller art.
Right. Yeah.
You know, one, I don't have the eyes for it. And painting a 1 inch head is so much harder than painting a 4 or 5 inch head.
Right.
And the 4 or 5 inch head can make, you know, you can make it with beautiful marks, and that's exactly what you want. And you can do it once and it's lovely. It's got all that freshness in there. And the little one you paint literally 6, 7, 8 times.
Hmm.
And by the time you do, it just feels like it's been, you know, chewed on forever and it's lost its freshness. So yeah. Um, and it's I've got a couple galleries I really like, and I try to keep them fed and have them have their that work on the wall. Or you can go
Hmm.
to Artsy. I think both my galleries are now back on Artsy.
Okay.
So even if you went to Artsy, you can see pretty much everything I have on offer through galleries. There's still a handful of pieces that you can find on my website, and you can differentiate because I have a gallery that's all available art, and
Yeah.
then in that it tells you what gallery it's available at, or if it says contact me directly, then you know it's me.
Hmm. Yeah. And of
Um,
course, we will have the links in the description of the video
it's
for your
yeah,
website and everything.
it's just daveseeley.com. We'll
Hmm.
take you to my front page. And right now, the front page animation it used to be an animation of science fiction fantasy art, and now it's all about the fine art.
Yeah.
And you have to click on the illustration, the gateway on the first page. You got a choice. You either go illustration or fine art.
Hmm.
And it's amazing how many like the if you love my science fiction and fantasy art,
Hmm.
um, I would say 1 in 20 people who love my science fiction fantasy art will like my
Interesting.
gallery art. And anyone who likes my gallery art, it's like if I go find people in the fine art world that like my gallery art, there even a fewer number will like my science fiction fantasy art.
That's disappointing because it's so good. Both are so
I'm just
good.
saying that, different strokes for different folks, and there's not anywhere near as big a crossover as you would think.
That is very surprising to me. I mean, I kind of understand it because I can even say for myself, I prefer
Yeah,
the
yeah.
science fiction fantasy stuff. But I follow you on stuff and I see you when you post your paintings and I just even the ones that are your figurative stuff, I'm like, that's just so gorgeous. It's so well done. So I'm an admirer of all of it, but
Right.
that's
So there,
unfortunate
I
that they
mean,
don't.
honestly, I would
Mhm.
expect you if you think that the science fiction fantasy art is well done, I would expect you to think that the fine art is well done, but I wouldn't expect you to like it,
Interesting.
right?
Right.
And honestly, there is both. Um, I personally will like both fine art and science fiction fantasy art that I feel is not that well painted.
Really?
Just like the concept or the idea or whatever it is. And then if I screw my eyeball up to it and see how it's made, I'm almost always disappointed. And it's
Mhm.
thrilling when I'm not.
Yeah. It's kind of like
So
some authors, they have trouble once they get into the business of reading other people's books, because then all they can think about is the process of producing the book.
fair enough.
Yeah. So do you have anything specific, any specific paintings or specific things coming up in the future that you want to plug?
You know what I would say is social media. I mean,
Yeah.
social media, it's like I've been on social media since uh my Art of Dave Seeley book came out in 2016, maybe.
Hmm.
Um, and I joined Facebook in order to promote that. So but I have to say that I believe after several years of effort that it's very, very little bang for the buck. And Meta has slowly sort of uh, choked out the life in terms of how many people you can see. For
Hmm.
instance, and the where I'm going with this story is that I've recently been posting stuff on YouTube.
Yep.
Um, and for an example, it's like there's coming up on 5,000 friend max on my Facebook page.
Hmm.
If I post a video there of one of my paintings,
Yeah.
um, I can see with videos how many people have actually played it.
Hmm.
Like typically if I can see with still images how many people liked it,
Yep.
but not how many people saw it.
Hmm.
But with videos, you can see how many people actually played it.
Yep.
So typically in my group of 5,000, I'll get about 230 people will actually see it
Yeah.
at all. Contrast that to YouTube. Um, my number one, and honestly, there was a piece that I started years ago in a retreat 6 years ago. And I was documenting it. And because of the pain in the butt of documenting while I'm working,
Hmm.
which I hate, because it just pulls my mind away from where it needs to be, to check the camera and make sure it's recording and whatever, you're doing. Um, at any rate, I finally got the chance to finish that. And I published a flyover, which is like a 2-minute pan in, zoom around, back out again
Hmm.
of the interim one that has been sitting around for 6 years. And I did that probably last January. And I noticed over the course of documenting and finishing the other one that this thing kind of caught on YouTube, and now there were
Hmm.
7,000 views. And I'm like,
Yep.
wow. I mean, I have no idea what that means in terms of will people in name building or selling art or whatever it's going to be,
Hmm.
but it's impressive in terms of the amount of people that are actually seeing it,
Yeah.
right? And so I've tried to feed instead of spending a bunch of time on Meta, which little by little is getting to be less and less and less response or likes or views. Um, it just seemed like there was a sort of a very low payoff in terms of the efforts of maintaining your Meta, Instagram, your Facebook, and by contrast, YouTube could be amazing. For instance, I think my top video now has 86,000 views.
That's fantastic.
And
Very
it was
well.
like it was a little vertical iPhone walkthrough of a show opening that I had a year ago in my Provincetown, Mass art gallery.
Hmm.
It's like, what? So nutty. And then the one that so the flyover of the half done piece that I was telling you about, that one um I think got up to about 7,500.
Hmm.
And then I posted the final one along with some process so you could see like time lapse of the painting of it from the very beginning all the way
Yeah.
through. So two time lapses, one leading up to the interim and then the other one the distance between the two. And the final one blew that one away and was so there you go. Go check this one out. It's 28,000 views for one fine art piece, right? So that one kind of then blew past the first one,
Mm-hmm.
which was the half done one.
Right.
But there are other ones that I'll post and they'll get like 150 or 200 views.
Right.
But those are much more like meta, right?
Yeah.
But
But
still,
at
that's
least you have the
probably
chance
only
with YouTube. You have the chance to get
right,
reach thousands. Whereas with Meta, first of all, you're limited in your potential with the 5,000 friends or however many it is. But then also, it's like people will only see it if you're friends. Whereas on YouTube, you don't have to be subscribed to someone to see their content
right.
recommended to you.
And God knows, I have no idea how YouTube, I mean, and it's all because of YouTube recommends,
Right. Yep.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, how do they determine what they're going to recommend and when? No idea, right?
Yeah.
So there's a couple that, they're crazy. They're up into the, 70, 80,000 views
Right.
and then 200.
Right. I get that.
So I don't
It's
know.
you just it's I think it seems to me that it's like you just put it out there if you can, and then you have a it's like you have a chance that it could go big, and there's a chance it might not. But you're the whole goal of it is to get yourself out there, and
Right.
I think that's a wise move with YouTube because I do agree that
Oh, in
Facebook is a
fact,
little bit more difficult.
I think I even we had an exchange on Facebook about
Hmm.
this, right?
Yeah.
And in the end, it's like for me, it's like there's a fair amount of nudity in the paintings, and I don't
Yep.
know what their tolerance is, right? And it's like you cannot get plain language about it in their community standards.
Yes.
And I've even been slapped, and I assumed that the slap was about that by them, but in the end, I think that it might have been about um the thumbnail
Yeah.
particularly and not about the thing at all. And
Hmm.
supposedly artwork, I mean, there's nothing in my artwork that isn't in public statuary in Rome,
Right. Yeah.
right? But
Hmm.
and they lump together nudity and sexuality, and I mean, and my pieces are not about sexuality, right?
Right.
So I don't know. I fear, you know, I fear contesting when they slap me because are they going to come back and scrutinize my whole channel?
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
Better to let it lie.
Hmm. That's why I'm very, I'm very careful like in my YouTube. For one, I'm very careful about copyright. Like I try not to include anything that would get me like a copyright thing. And then also I'm very careful on language, very careful on all that stuff because I'm like you, I do not want to get the strike and then potentially, risk combating
Right,
it or something. So
right.
I'm just like I want to
And
be
I
careful.
feel like for instance, gallery, like on Meta, I can put all of my stuff up
Yep.
and it's
Hmm.
not a problem, right?
Right.
And then if I've had friends who tried to advertise on Meta and the galleries, like Beautiful Bizarre Magazine, they chose a floating guy who is full frontal nudity for their fine art prize 2 years ago. It was a
Hmm.
finalist, very
Yeah.
prestigious award, everything great. But they put it on Meta and they're blacking out his genitalia, right? And I'm like, oh my God, you can't do that in a way that it looks like that's what I've painted
Right. Yeah.
because it looks like it's a painting about censorship.
Right. Yes,
Right.
it would look like a painting about censorship. You're right.
Right. And then I'm like, it also was a eye opener because and I said, I post on Facebook and I said, um, wow, I can't believe that Beautiful Bizarre Magazine has to do this. And then I get a little message from them going, you're saying bad things about us. And I'm like, actually, no, I did not. What I said was, I can't believe that you have to, self-police yourself like this, right?
Right.
And 20 lines later, they're like, yeah, Meta has a lot to answer for, you know? So I feel like we're getting along fine, but and my gallery, my Denver gallery was like if you posted a piece that went back to a gallery on their site that had nudity, it's like the little meta church ladies would go find it and ding you.
Mm,
And so all of these, because essentially Meta is a monopoly online, everyone lives in fear of being canceled by them.
right,
And you don't really know what the criterion is, right? It's like I'm not doing pornography.
right.
I'm not doing things that are overtly about sexuality. But, it's like the taste of salt. If you have a an evangelical or they'll look at what I'm doing and go, oh, you know, like they're invoking Satan. And I get that's out there, but I hate that literally art has conformed to this, right? It's like the deal is that if you know, artists will refrain from painting nudity because they're scared to death that they'll be canceled. So they would
Right.
rather not paint it and have a presence than the other way around. So clearly that's had an effect on content for artists.
Hmm.
And I think that's a bad thing. So part of me wants to have a conversation with a live human being at YouTube, and part of me is scared to death that I'll awaken the church ladies.
You what you need to do is you have another, another account that you do it through to try to test the waters.
I think if they decide I'm done, I'm done.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense.
So I can't do it twice or three times.
Right.
It's like I shot a great model a couple of years ago, and models that actually shoot nude are their own breed. Oftentimes, they're people who are they've been marginalized in typical society. Like they like many female models are lesbians
Mm,
already outside of you know norms. So they're like, yeah, I don't care. And so I had one that sort of went out to LA and was kind of essentially a fledgling porn star artist. She was, I mean, and her game was literally having 10 different accounts. And every time that they would cancel one, she would already have solicited her base to, follow their backup accounts. And that was the game. But in the end, it's silly. It's like I don't want to play that game. If I could speak to the great God YouTube and say, listen, here's my portfolio on my website. This is what I want to show people. And they said, yeah, do that. Then I'm good. And if they said, no, we can't show that, I'd be like, okay, good. I'm done with you.
right. The not knowing is difficult, I know.
And there's no real way to know, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's like the language, part of the slap for my thumbnail was you go through a training with them. And
Hmm.
it's very clear that they don't want you to be exploiting other people without their knowledge or whatever, all kind of obvious stuff in the end.
Hmm.
You don't want to be bullying, you don't want to be, you name it. But when it gets down to, when is the fine art nude over the explicit line and become beyond their guidelines? There's no way to know. And even if you go online, if you go on Google and you start, trying to get into discussions of that, essentially nobody knows. And the most common answer is, yeah, why would you bother? Just don't. Right. And I'm like, yeah, except that's what I want to pay.
Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, there you go.
Well, thank you so much for
Yeah,
coming to do the interview here. I really
good chatting.
appreciate
Yeah.
it. We'll have all your little links on the down below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.